Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthology, written and narrated by Dr. Jeffrey A. Robinson. Ghostwriter. I fell in love with the house the first time that I saw it. It sat well back from the road at the end of a long curved driveway that threaded its way through a thick stand of trees that hid it from view from passing cars. Surrounded by the nearby trees, it seemed isolated and very different from the suburban sprawl just out of sight. It was remarkably well priced for its location in upstate New York. My realtor accompanied me and made a small ceremony of having me sign the last of her required paperwork, after which she handed me the key to the estate. "This is really a dream come true for me," I said. "I can't believe I actually own the house that Lucas Halloway lived in." Pausing, I added, "He was my hero when I was in high school. After I read his book, The Journey West, I wanted nothing more than to become a writer myself. And now," I thought, "after publishing my first bestseller, I now have the money to buy this place, even if it did take almost every cent I have." "Yes," replied the realtor, a good-looking woman in her early 40s. "Lucas was something of a celebrity in these parts, particularly because of the mystery that surrounded him." "Mystery?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "He'd already become quite famous for his many books, but after they rewarded him with the Nobel Prize for Literature, he never wrote again." I nodded and said, "Yes. After I read The Journey West, I went back and read everything else he'd ever written, and I always looked forward to his next book. But you're right, he never published anything more." "Well," said the realtor in an almost conspiratorial manner, "rumors say he wrote constantly, but he never produced another book. Apparently, he never thought that anything he wrote matched the quality of his most famous work. People say he wrote non-stop every day, but he was never satisfied with anything he produced." "And then he died," I said sadly, "without publishing anything more." "Oh," said the woman quietly, "the rumor is that he did finish his last book, after working on it for nearly 20 years. In fact, his son lived here for a few months after Lucas died, and he said that the old man actually finished his new masterpiece the very night he died. The fire that killed him was confined to the master bedroom, and while Lucas only died of smoke inhalation, the fire destroyed his laptop and all his notes. If he did finish it, nothing remained except ashes." I shook my head slowly. What a tragedy, I thought. "Anyway," she said, "his son only lived here a few months while the fire damage was being repaired, but he decided to put the entire estate on the market. Since he doesn't have a wife or children, he didn't want to live here alone." Putting her hand to her mouth, she gasped, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Allister. I know you're single. I didn't mean to imply—" "No, it's okay," I said, cutting her off. "I do want to live alone. In fact, that's why I bought this place. What better location for me to live and work on my own next novel than the home of the writer who inspired me so long ago?" "Well, I wish you luck, Mr. Allister," she said politely. Then she handed me the keys, offered a few excuses to leave, and said goodbye. Gazing up at the tall, wide wooden doors, I unlocked them and entered. The entrance opened to a large central atrium with large double doors to either side. To the right was a large library and study. To the left was a parlor that led to a formal dining room. Both rooms were pristinely clean. Probably professionally cleaned by some company hired by the realtor, I thought. Skylights in the ceiling high above lit the atrium, and it was bright even though no internal lights were on. In front of him rose a wide stairway that stopped at a platform about 15 feet high. Then it split into more stairs that stretched to either side and opened to the rooms on the second floor. At the head of the stairs, looking out toward the door, was a larger-than-life, full-body portrait of the late Nobel laureate. The figure in the painting was attired in long black robes like those you might wear to a graduation, and then I remembered that Lucas received several honorary doctorates in literature following his nomination for the Nobel Prize, and that he'd worn such robes at their ceremony in Sweden. The painting must have been made commemorating that occasion, I thought. On the ground floor, to either side of the stairs, were doors leading to a large kitchen and other rooms, a bathroom, laundry, and storage. The stairs to the second floor led to the master bedroom and guest bedrooms. Overall, I was quite pleased. This would be the perfect place for writing. It was isolated and quiet. Then I chuckled to myself and thought, if my latest book stays on the bestseller list a while longer, or if some studio buys a movie rights for the novel, I might even hire a butler or maid or cook. I went out to my car and retrieved my luggage, which consisted of several large suitcases and nearly a dozen boxes. But after several trips up to my room, I grew tired. A trip to the kitchen proved to be a futile effort since the cupboards and refrigerator were empty. Therefore, I called one of the local restaurant delivery services and gave them a credit card with instructions to bring meals 3 times a day until I could do some shopping and restock the pantry. Then I decided to go into the study to relax. But instead, I spent more than an hour just perusing the books in the library. Eventually, I settled into a wonderfully comfortable, overstuffed chair, planning only to relax for a few minutes, but I promptly fell asleep. I slept fitfully that first night in that large recliner and woke before dawn, stiff and sore. My mind was troubled with the nagging memory of disturbing dreams that I couldn't quite recall. Still, I must have slept well enough, since I'd spent nearly 12 hours in that chair. Making a final trip to my car for my writing materials, I found food in a container at my front door. It must have been delivered for dinner after I'd fallen asleep. I ate the cold meal as I set up my writing equipment in the study. Setting an empty food cartons to one side, I opened my laptop word processor and arranged my collection of journals and notes, eager to start work on my next book. Unfortunately, as I settled behind the large mahogany wood desk, my inspiration faded, and I was struck with a classic and profound case of writer's block. Despite hours of false starts, nothing substantive came to mind. I could not seem to focus on a single topic long enough, though I had prepared notes on more than a dozen potential ideas for my next bestseller. While I had thought of working in this place would be an inspiration, I found it somewhat intimidating. Halloway's book, The Journey West, had become famous because it was so rich in passion and pathos. It had been a story about a young girl, a war refugee, an immigrant, who fled her home, traveling from one place to another, which always seemed worse than the one before. It had been a tale filled with intense emotions, fear, terror, despair, hope, joy, and love. One famous reviewer said that only sociopaths could read the novel without shedding tears of both sadness and joy. It garnered unprecedented acclaim and was immediately translated into dozens of other languages where it was universally well received. As I sat at my word processor, I wondered how I could have ever imagined that I could write anything that wouldn't seem crude and amateurish in comparison. I struggled through the day with more than a dozen abortive false starts, and as the evening settled over the manor, I stood with the intention of stretching my legs and decided to venture outside to explore the grounds. I opened the door to find that my dinner had been silently delivered, so I picked it up, but as I approached the porch steps, I was struck with an attack of anxiety, the likes of which I had not experienced since childhood. As a child, in elementary school, I had suffered some particularly severe bouts of agoraphobia, fear of open spaces. Indeed, they grew so intense that attempts to take me to school led to seizures that required hospitalization. It had been a terrifying experience for a young child, and the incidents made me even more afraid of the outside world. Eventually, it took several rounds of different medications and therapy before my anxiety was quelled enough that I could resume a normal schedule at school. As I grew older, the incidents grew less frequent, and with continued medication and periodic counseling, they stopped completely by the time high school began. However, standing at the door of the mansion, I felt the same cold, silent terror pass over me like an icy winter wind. Grabbing the food, consisting of my forgotten lunch and the freshly delivered dinner, I ducked back into the house and felt my attack of anxiety fade, leaving me curious about what might have caused it and slightly terrified that it had occurred at all. Retiring to the dining room, I ate my meal sitting alone at a large wooden table, and while my surroundings were spacious and elegant, I found them somewhat depressing, particularly with memories that my panic attack brought to mind. After dinner, I returned to my writing desk, but couldn't shake off that dreadful anxiety. After a few hours, I stared at my laptop, having never managed to write a single sentence. Giving up for the day, I searched the parlor and found a fully stocked liquor cabinet. Taking a full bottle of single malt Scotch whiskey to the master bedroom, I drank until I finally fell asleep. My dreams, however, were quite disturbing. I dreamt of the characters in Lucas Holloway's famous book, but instead of the joyful and triumphant ending, the beloved heroine suffered a tragic death at the hands of the evil villains from whom she had fled. In my dream, as I stood over her forlorn corpse, I heard a voice behind me, and spinning around beheld the image of Lucas Holloway in his long black academic gown, glaring at me and then down at the broken body of his last book's champion. He said, "Isn't it tragic when a story doesn't finish the way it should?" Staring at her bloody remains, I stuttered, "But she was always my favorite." Tears came unbidden to my face, and I said imploringly, "It wasn't supposed to end this way." Nodding, he fixed his gaze on me once more and said, "No, it's not." Then he waved his hand, and the girl's body vanished, along with everything around me, leaving me alone on an empty, black plain. "Finish my book," thundered Lucas's disembodied voice. "Finish my book." Then I woke, sitting bolt upright in bed with my heart pounding so hard I thought it would leap out of my chest. I trembled and shook, with sweat dripping from my brow. Glancing at the clock, I found it was only a little past midnight. "It was only a dream," I said to myself. "It was only a dream." Silence filled the house, except for a voice that echoed in my memory. "Finish my book." I was exhausted and too tired to climb out of bed, and promptly fell asleep again. That was the night that the dreams began. That night, my sleep was interrupted by vivid dreams, the kind that seem so realistic that you can't tell whether or not they're real. The images I saw were brightly colored and had supernatural clarity. They were completely immersive, detailed, and I watched events as if I was outside the dream itself. In the dream, a pair of children, waifs living on the streets in some nameless slum of a big city, a boy and girl, siblings who had nothing except each other, who knew nothing of the world around them except hunger, deprivation, and indifference. I witnessed them struggle through a single day of their dire existence, and then I abruptly woke. I knew that this was where Holloway's book would have picked up, and felt as if I had been magically inspired. Hurrying to the study downstairs, I started typing the events of my dreams as the words flowed from my mind like a gushing hose. Looking up, I realized that hours had passed. Exhausted, I decided to take a short nap in the comfortable overstuffed chair by the fireplace. But no sooner had I fallen asleep than I found myself once more trapped by dreams. The problem was, it was the same dream that I had had the night before. It was identical in every way. However, when it finished, it began again. That night I must have relived those scenes a dozen times. I woke, frantic and horrified. I tried to understand what the dreams meant and came to the conclusion that what I had written hadn't quite been right. So I hurried to my computer and started to rewrite that first chapter. And that's how I spent the next several days. I would rewrite every scene and every scrap of dialogue, searching to find just the right adjective or verb. I would write until I was exhausted and would then fall asleep, only to relive that same scene over and over again. Eventually, I slept one entire night without any dreams at all, and woke to find that 3 days had passed. Stumbling to the front door, I found that more than a half-dozen packaged meals had been delivered during my uninterrupted writing spree. After bringing them inside, I ate ravenously, seated on the floor of the entry hall. Having quelled my hunger and sated my thirst, I ventured upstairs, showered and shaved, wondering what had caused me to become so obsessed with writing that small opening piece. Going to my desk, I read what I had written and was amazed. It was flawless. Every word was ideally placed, every verb and noun and every punctuation point was perfect. I could scarcely believe that I had written it. But I had completely worn myself out in the endeavor, and despite the fact that I had only been up a few hours, I found myself too weary to do more than drag myself upstairs and throw myself into bed. Oblivious to what time it was, I collapsed and slept once more. But instead of a peaceful slumber that I had experienced the night before, the dream started again. But this time the dream picked up where the previous ones had stopped, and I realized that I was experiencing the second chapter of the novel I had just begun. It was then that I realized that what I was writing was not my novel. It was Lucas Halloway's, and I was being driven to do as he commanded when he told me to finish his book. And that is how I came to spend the next few weeks and months at Halloway's mansion. I would sleep for a few hours and then wake, compelled to write what I had dreamt. And then I would dream that scene or chapter over and over again, writing and rewriting until it was perfect. Then I would be rewarded with a day or two of relative peace before the cycle began again. I don't remember much of those days except for a few lucid moments. when I recovered briefly from those manic frenzies of writing. I recall trying to leave a few times, but only once did I make it off the porch before collapsing on the ground, shaking violently from a nameless horror that consumed me. I suffered fear that would not subside until I crawled on my hands and knees back into the house. Looking back, I think that's what hell must be like, a place of madness, unable to control my actions or thoughts while being compelled and driven to perform involuntary deeds. I'm not certain how long this cycle continued, until one day I woke to discover I hadn't been plagued by unwanted visitations. It was late in the day, but I must have slept more than 20 hours without those recurring nocturnal hallucinations. Feeling like I was recovering from a month-long drunken bender, I stood and staggered around the house. The entryway was littered with trash and the remains of countless meals. Garbage had piled up along the walls where it had been pushed aside. Upon a trip to the lavatory, I glanced in the mirror and found that I had grown a beard and that I must not have bathed for many weeks. My hair was long and unkempt, my face gaunt and thin, and the dark circles under my eyes were so deep that I looked like I had risen from my own deathbed. Days passed as I recovered. Eventually, I gathered the courage to venture back into the study, where I turned on my laptop and read what I had written. I was amazed. It was indeed a companion piece to Lucas Holloway's landmark novel. I only remembered portions of it, but that day I read it in one sitting, from beginning to end, as if experiencing it for the first time. As with Holloway's earlier masterpiece, I wept and laughed and cried. If anything, the work was superior to Lucas's last book. I loved it and hated it at the same time. I could not believe I had written it, but deep inside I knew I had not. For a passing moment, I thought of deleting it, but an unbidden wave of fear and anxiety stopped me and held me rigid until the idea passed. Instead, I opened my email, packaged the electronic manuscript into a compressed file, and sent it to my publisher. Upon doing so, I felt as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from me, and felt relieved and fulfilled. Despite the late hour, I decided to try once more to leave the house, and I further resolved not to return, no matter how strong the compulsion to stay might grow. Grabbing my wallet and my car keys, I hurried to the atrium and glanced up at Holloway's picture at the top of the stairs. I imagined a voice whispering to me, saying, "You are done now. You have finished my book." Opening the front doors, I took a deep breath and ran across the porch. I thought I would hit that icy wall of fear on the way, and had resolved myself to run through it, but it did not appear. It was raining lightly as I ran, and I dared not stop in case I had another debilitating anxiety attack. Out of breath, I reached the gates that led to the streets outside. Then I turned and looked back up the long driveway. I had left my car far behind me at the house, but I was not willing to go back to fetch it. It took me 3 tries to remember the code to the security keypad to open the gate. But when it finally opened, I hurried through them, not looking back. Then, in the rain, I started walking down the road, barefooted and wearing nothing but a dirty terrycloth bathrobe. I staggered through the night, making my way along the nearby road with no thought of where to go except to get away. It seemed that I walked for hours. There was little traffic so late in the evening, but the cars that slowed hurried and sped away upon getting a closer look at me. I remember passing residential houses and later some stores. Eventually I stopped at a roadside motel. Making my way to the receptionist, I produced a credit card from my wallet and gave it to the clerk. Several days later, after doing nothing except sleep and eat pizza that I'd had delivered, I found that I had recovered my wits and some of my strength. It was only then that I phoned my publisher, who confirmed that he had gotten the manuscript that I had sent. Since receiving the electronic document, he had been frantically trying to contact me. He sent people to my house and found it open and abandoned. It was then that he filed a missing person report with the police. After I hung up, my publisher rushed to the motel with papers for me to sign. He had, of course, loved the book and had already changed his publishing schedule to get it printing started as soon as possible. In fact, he already outlined an advertising campaign and promptly sent the book to critics and reviewers, all of whom loved it as well. With his help, I purchased some clothes and cleaned myself up. Then he had me move to a fancy hotel downtown. It was more than a year before I returned to that house. Since leaving it, the days had blurred in a series of meetings and press conferences, speaking engagements and interviews. As praise for the book grew, I appeared on several cable news channels. The days that followed were filled with book signings, award ceremonies, conference meetings with movie producers who wanted to purchase the rights to my book. By the end of the year, I was wealthy and famous beyond anything I had imagined. I had purchased one house on the West Coast and another in Hawaii, as far from my now abandoned estate as possible. Oh, and I spent a lot of time and a small fortune going to therapists. I no longer had any desire to write. Whatever enjoyment I had once had in such work had been burned away. The thought of writing now only filled me with revulsion. Of course, I never told anyone, except my therapist, about the haunting dreams that I had experienced. My publisher constantly nagged me to find out when I might start another book. Fans, critics, and interviewers all asked me the same question endlessly. When they inquired, I would smile, nod, and be non-committal, but privately I planned on never writing again. At the age of 38, I was rich enough that I would never have to work again, and I had decided to never write again. Not so much as a brief email. By the end of the year, I had settled into a life of comfort, luxury, and travel in what most would consider to be an endless vacation. And that is how I would have spent the rest of my days, except for the insistence of my therapist. Dr. Barrega had successfully convinced me that my notions of being haunted by Lucas Holloway had been nothing more than an obsessive delusion. Moreover, he explained that I had simply developed a compulsion to write a masterpiece on par with his books. He said it was a combination of awe of my favorite author combined with the fear of failure that I would never produce anything of the same quality. All this contributed to my childhood fears and anxieties, producing a psychosis that drove me temporarily insane. He insisted that I was cured, but I could really only overcome my doubts by facing my fears one last time. According to him, all I had to do was visit the house, just once, before selling it as I wanted. Therefore, just before Thanksgiving, I found myself once more standing at Lucas Holloway's mansion. After my abrupt departure, my publisher had locked up the house and cleaners had come and fixed up the place. It was once again in pristine condition and just waiting to be placed on the market. With my newfound acclaim, I had been assured that I would make a very handsome profit on the sale. Taking a deep, cleansing breath, I practiced the meditative techniques that I had mastered from my many months of therapy. I unlocked the front doors and entered the manor. Dark memories of the place came to mind, and I was grateful that I had taken double the normal dose of my medications. Looking up at the painting of Lucas Holloway in his long black robes, I laughed at him, knowing that he had no power over me anymore. Then I turned to go and felt myself involuntarily stop. It was as if I had hit a solid wall of ice. The fear and anxiety that I had long dreaded had returned, and I found it difficult to breathe. Slowly turning back toward the stairs, I trembled as I watched Lucas's translucent shade step out of the painting and slowly descend the steps toward me. I tried to flee, but could not. I tried to scream, but could not find the breath. Lucas stopped about 6 feet from me and looked down menacingly. Then he leaned close and whispered, "You have done well. But I have in mind a sequel." At first I was paralyzed. I could not even make the slightest movement. The terror I felt dwarfed anything I had ever experienced before. Then I thought of the absurdity of the situation, and I chuckled. Lucas leaned back in surprise. It was then that I started to laugh harder, and with each passing moment, my laughter grew. Soon I was guffawing loudly. I laughed so hard that I fell to my knees and tears came to my eyes. Then, without realizing it, I found my tears flowing in torrents as I wept at the thought of having to write again, here, with him. I sobbed and wailed until I grew faint from lack of air. At that point I must have passed out or fainted, because that's when the real nightmares began. Thank you for listening. As you know by now, we love our listeners, fans, patrons, and supporters. Please let us know what you think of our podcast and our stories. The best way to do that is to subscribe to our podcast at untold-tales.com. By doing so, you'll be added to our mailing list so you can be notified of upcoming episodes, blogs, and other information. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.